Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar on HR practitioner perspectives, keeping your house in order in India. My name is Michael Green. I am the Director for Government Affairs and Strategic Development based out of Sanam S4's Washington, D.C. office. And I'm delighted to have two experts in their field, my colleague Susmita Sen, who has over 15 years of HR experience globally and in India. She works very closely with a range of small, medium-sized businesses, large businesses, nonprofits on effectively running their HR operation in India. We also have Vikram Shroff with us from the law firm of Nishith Desai Associates. Sanam S4 and Nishith Desai Associates have a long standing partnership and have worked together on a number of different projects. So we're really excited to have him here with us and his expertise in employment and labor law and provide those insights throughout the presentation. So the concept of this initial webinar is to really kind of go from onboarding to offboarding, so the entire employment life cycle, and give those who are joining us a view of what that looks like, what you might want to be watching out for. There's 15 slides. They're fairly detailed, and we wanted to keep them that way for reference material for everybody who has registered and has joined us. But we do plan to make this a series, and going forward, we'll hone in on different areas, whether it be exiting of employees or compensation and benefits, and other areas that I think will deserve, all of these areas really deserve more attention than we'll be able to give them today, but we'll do our best with the task at hand. So the plan is, very shortly, I'll turn it over to Susmita to kick us off and start leading us through the slides. Her and Vikram will go back and forth. I will pepper in questions throughout, and we'll ask that everybody, if you do have questions, there's a chat box should be in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. I'd suggest that you type those your questions in there, and we'll take them at the end. But to ensure that you kind of get your questions answered, we'll do the best we can. So with that, and keeping in mind that we have lots to get through, I'll turn it over to Susmita. So Susmita, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good morning, depending on which part of the geography you really belong to. This is, like Michael said, first in a series. So in a sense, we'll talk about the different processes in the employee life cycle, and it's largely a bird's eye view of the processes, because a lot of you who are HR practitioners, as we run through the different slides, would also get to understand that each of the processes in itself have comprehensive coverage to make. With that, we start the session today. First, we'd like to talk about the employee life cycle and what really does the employee life cycle cover for us. The employee life cycle encompasses various stages in the career of an employee. The ELC model, as they popularly call it, talks about the methods that an employee engages with the organization that they are a part of, and typically can be differentiated into 5 stages, starting with recruitment or talent sourcing, as it's popularly called. The next is onboarding, development, retention, and finally, it is about separation or offboarding. Recruitment typically is the series of events in an organization from the time a position is created, to skill mapping, identification, assessments, interviews, etc., that qualify an incumbent when applying for an open position. Onboarding is how the new hires are brought up to speed on the company's policies and procedures at the time of joining. Development is about all the avenues that are available to employees to identify a professional growth path and develop a plan for themselves to reskill and upskill themselves and enhance their employability quotient. Now, very commonplace boardroom conundrum around this is how prudent is it to spend, loads of dollars on upskilling employees? What if they leave? And the popular answer to this is look at the other side. What if they are redundant and they stay? You have a bigger problem at hand with that. The next is the retention, and employee retention refers to various factors which have an interplay in deciding the employee's longevity in the organization, like the leadership, vision, communication in the organization, the workplace culture, policies, practices, etc., etc. And finally, we come to offboarding, which is the last stage in the life cycle of an employee in an organization, and it could be voluntary or involuntary. And why are we talking about these 5 stages today? It is because managing this employee life cycle is a function to prioritize because it involves the company's most critical asset, its people.
So maybe I'll just take on from there, and I wanted to start with thanking Michael and Susmita for inviting me for this webinar. It's obviously a topic that is close to heart and something that I've been focusing on since I joined the firm. While we are discussing about employee life cycle, I do like to caution my clients that we are dealing with a country where there are a plethora of labor laws, laws on almost every topic that you could imagine, and several of these laws were really drafted keeping in mind the industrial era, where you really didn't have the services sector or the IT companies, and we are now trying to extend those laws to the sort of progressive sectors. So there will be several challenges. So I do end up cautioning my clients, especially those who are abroad and looking to set up their operations in India, that it's typically easy come but not easy go when it comes to closing down and firing your employees. And we'll talk about some of those laws and some of the difficulties that employers face. But before that, maybe I'd like to spend a moment on how active the new government has been in terms of carrying out reforms, including on the labor law front. As Michael would have seen and probably can confirm based on all his good work at Sanam S4 and previously at USIBC, that the Indian government is taking the World Bank survey on ease of doing business quite seriously, and over the last 3 to 4 years, India has jumped over almost 60 spots. So this in a bid to kind of continue to reform the country and make it easier to do business in India and attract foreign investment. The government is constantly trying to relook at several labor laws, and one of the biggest changes that we've seen in recent times is the codification of the labor laws, where several of these laws at the central level will be eventually converted into 4 codes. The code on wages has already been enacted, although the effective date is yet to come out. We will soon see another code which is on occupational safety, health and working conditions. And then there are 2 other codes that are going to be coming up. One is on social security and welfare, and the other is on industrial relations. So over time, and as a result of codification of these laws, we are hoping that it becomes easier to do business in India. And at the same time, in terms of simultaneous activity, there, you keep seeing several other changes where minimum wages keep increasing. There has been a healthy competition between state governments to attract foreign investors by providing incentives to investors and making it easier to work, for example, in night shift. Um, increased threshold for engaging contract laborers, a unique law that we have in India. So a lot of effort is going on at the back end to continue to reform the country, and labor law is one of the core areas of reform, given that the government mandate is to increase and generate more employment opportunities in India.
So Vikram, Michael here. In terms of the in terms of the many different labor laws that currently exist and are important for compliance for any organization operating in India, do you see the codification and perhaps simplification of these laws being a major game changer, or a lot of the things that are in place today likely to continue? Or what does kind of the new labor law landscape look like with these kind of 4 codes coming online soon?
Well, if you ask me if it's going to be a game changer, I would say no, because the effort till now has largely been in terms of consolidation of the labor laws and ease of compliances, rather than really reforming the laws. When these codes were drafted, there was a bit of inputs from the industry that this is not really the kind of laws that we are looking for. What they have basically done, at least in relation to the code of wages, which is already out, is basically consolidated 4 labor laws and put it all into one, rather than really looking at it afresh and trying to ask whether are these laws even required and relevant for the industry, for the services sector that's bringing in almost 60 to 70% of the revenue. So the GDP. So the answer is no, and it might be seen as a lost opportunity for the government. But I would say the efforts are on, because changing labor laws in a country like India would mean that it's really a massive effort. There are so many stakeholders: the government, the employees union, the employers union, the central trade unions. Everyone's kind of all playing a key role, and it's almost impossible. It obviously directly affects the vote banks as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So Susmita, I think over to you on the next slide.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So thanks, Vikram. I mean, that was quite a eye-opener for us in terms of understanding the codification bit and the government's active stand in this exercise. With this, we move to the first of the employee life cycle, the first process being talent sourcing. Now, like Michael said, each of these processes would perhaps be covered separately in a series. But today we talk more about the challenges that we see in talent sourcing that are looming large in the industry. So talent sourcing is a structured method of identifying, engaging, and networking with relevant talent pools of best fit prospective candidates, with the aim to generate a steady candidate flow for both your current as well as your future requisitions. However, but let's talk about how sourcing new talent in this rapidly growing economic landscape is increasingly becoming difficult today. Multiple surveys indicate that attracting quality talent is one of the biggest challenges being faced by businesses. And some of the top reasons are a humongous shortage of talent in the industry. A big reason why companies are finding it difficult to fill jobs is due to the widening skill gap. A very recent Conferry research on global talent shortage mentioned that the shortage can grow up to about 85.2 million people by 2025, which is a frightening situation where companies could lose billions of dollars in lost economic opportunity if that happened. And as demand outpaces supply, competition for qualified candidates is only likely to grow.
Yeah,
Complex, the process is, yeah, Michael.
I was just gonna say, I think, you know, talent acquisition and talent sourcing, you know, it is a big challenge, I think, because of the supply gap. But also, I think it's really important that organizations have a process in place to really try to, you know, find the right talent. And I think that means spending a lot of time on JDs. What we've found is that a lot of organizations will be, you know, you'll go through a process and then you'll realize that the JD should change this way. Well, sometimes that's a completely different kind of search and criterion and profile of individual out in the market. So spending time, and I think you're getting to this, but spending time at the early stage will save a lot of time later.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's what the slide indicates where we talk about the talent sourcing process. However, I mean, what we're like I said, what we're focusing on right now are also the bigger challenges that are you know, staring at our faces in terms of talent sourcing. And one of them, like you mentioned and I mentioned, was the increasing skill gap. The other is, you know, the complexity of processes and timeline challenges. Hence, you know, teams that are responsible for sourcing end up needing to choose between doing the job thoroughly or, you know, doing it fast at the cost of not doing a good quality job. A third aspect is also about managing global expectations. So many of our clients are global clients and they're looking at, you know, setting up businesses in India. But the challenge here is maintaining that fine balance between building brand awareness for these clients and sourcing the right talent for them. Often these large multinational corporations have to deal with localized hiring rules and patterns, etc., with very limited integration knowledge and experience, which delays their hiring process and could also lead to, you know, missing out on the best fit candidates that they're really looking for. The last in this whole challenge game is, and which is a common phenomena across different processes, is the data overreach, I would say. So the issue of having too much data but not clear guidelines and no efficient ways to use that data. So while there is a rise in use of technology for recruiting, most businesses still do not fully utilize the power of data to enhance their decision-making capabilities. And therefore, you know, lies the big problem of talent sourcing.
And just to add, even if you find the right talent, you know, we've got cases, especially in sectors like technology and outsourcing, where, you know, even if they accept the employment offer, they don't show up on day one, or they disappear in a few months and, you know, are just not contactable. You know, they become irregular. They use the offer letter from the prospective employer to negotiate with the current employer. So lots of those situations are common in India. I can tell you that I've had situations in, for example, the outsourcing sector, where the attrition rate is almost 70 to 80% every year. So you're also dealing with a very high attrition rate where you are not able to provide any sort of you know, work focus, and it just becomes a daily routine job for them. One point I'd like to make here is the importance of background checks, something that's often ignored in a rush to recruit. You are basically giving offers in hundreds of, hundreds of offers per month are being given, and background checks and the importance are typically ignored. And then you just need that one case to create a lot of issues in the organization. So just a reminder to all the participants that, in a country like India, background checks can't be ignored. Employment contracts, how do you draft it? Different companies in different sectors will have different employment contracts. The employment contract for a gig economy employee could be completely different from someone who's in IT and sort of involved in generating or developing intellectual property for the employer. um, how do you go about with the compensation, the sign-on bonus, relocation benefits? All these are critical considerations, and obviously we will not be going into detailed discussions in those aspects, but just to bring out or highlight some of those issues. One other issue that a client should know upfront is that you get the best talent, you train him, and then he works for the company, and is involved in critical projects. When he leaves the company, under Indian law, you can't really prevent him from joining a competitor or starting a competitive activity, because unlike in the UK, where reasonable non-compete restrictions are enforceable, in India, any form of non-compete restriction after termination of employment is not enforceable. It's considered void.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into the next set, which is onboarding. And to your point, Vikram, the importance of engaging the candidate all the way through up until the date they join. So you really do get a sense of, their intention of joining the organization. So I think that's one of the things that we've found in kind of practice, is making sure you're having regular communication. Oftentimes there's notice periods, which is, familiar to those in the UK and in Europe, but in the US, notice periods can really range from anywhere from, a month up to 6 months, depending on the seniority of the individual. So, people get busy with what, kind of the day-to-day, but really engaging those candidates until they do, go through the onboarding processes is critical to making sure they join your organization. So Susmita, over to you.
Absolutely, Michael, and that's exactly what I was trying to kind of, so I'm kind of culminating the points that you've just made, and the ones that Vikram just made, in terms of, how do you take care of, the job challenge? How do you take care of employees, potential employees who've taken an offer and are sitting on your offer, etc. So you've invested a lot of time and effort into your hiring process, and you've selected the so-called best person for your job. How do you ensure the person joins you? And onboarding is that process. Onboarding is the process of welcoming and integrating new employees into your company and into their new role. The onboarding process helps employees gain the necessary knowledge, skills, and behavior to become effective organizational members and so-called insiders. But my question is, and that's what I want to direct to all my clients who are listening in today. Does onboarding really begin, on the day of joining? The person has taken the offer, and the person is, sitting on your offer, and that's the time when it's during this time that they may receive many counter offers. If they are not fully invested, committed to your organization, they may change their mind immediately. And on the other hand, if you keep the communication going, answer questions, keep them warm, make the team introductions, help them, employees solidify their decision to join your organization and feel excited about starting in with you. That's the time when you really make that intervention of onboarding. So pre-boarding is where onboarding really kicks in. It's not on the day of joining, but much ahead in time, when employees are still not onboarded.
So Susmita, in terms of, and I think we could maybe revisit this at a later part in the series, just given where we're at with the time. But you know, once they sign the employment contract, you know, what does that first week look like? You know, what are a few key aspects for a successful onboarding experience? And then I think let's move over to policies, unless Vikram has a few points to add.
So, Michael, to your question, typically and traditionally, we've known onboarding, you know, to be that series of, you know, exercises, facilitation on the day of joining for a smooth transition to being an insider of the organization. However, today we know of organizations that are curating a series of initiatives and bespoke programs that are spanning a 6-month period to ensure excitement levels are sufficiently channelized, you know, for the new incumbent, and they set these people up for success. So that's the kind of onboarding programs that, you know, organizations are really investing in, and curating programs which are specific to individuals to ensure they are engaged and they are, you know, they see that sense of excitement, they feel that sense of excitement as being part of this organization. And understanding what this effective onboarding really means, this can really be a competitive advantage for any organization that you know, invests in these kind of programs and curating specific onboarding programs for new incumbents.
Yeah, I would agree, and experience suggests that some of the progressive employers are going all out to retain talent. You do read those surveys on you know, best employers to work for, best companies to work for, and you know, some of the initiatives that you come across you know, are quite unique, quite innovative, and you can see how closely they are involving and remaining engaged with their employees. But again, as lawyers, you obviously have to also look at it on the flip side, in the sense that, you know, you've invested so much in your talent, you know, training and education and facilities, and what if they leave within 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, you know, by getting a better offer? And you know, there are clients who also, on the other hand, want their employees upon joining to sign what we call as training bonds, which is nothing but a kind of a service commitment. And you know, these documents basically say that, you know, they will be trained for a certain period, and then, you know, they will have to give a commitment of remaining in employment for a certain additional period, and if they break that commitment, there would be certain financial obligations, certain consequences. Again, we will not really get into the legalities of those kind of agreements at this point in time, but it's common to see those kind of training bonds and service commitment letters being executed at the outset.
Thanks, Vikram.
Yeah.
So next, I think we'll get over to some of the HR policies and best practices. So Susmita, over to you to kind of work us through what that landscape looks like.
So the slide that everyone can see is kind of, you know, pretty much self-explanatory, but policies are created on the basis of key human resource management functions and are defined set of guidelines which are preset by the organization. Why is it done? It is done to ease the employer's life and to make you know, policies that are non-discriminatory and that are uniformly accepted and implemented for all. Typically, for a policy to be effective, it must be a carefully researched policy language. It should be simple. A thorough analysis of underlying management issues should have been done, and comprehensive legal documentation and analysis should also be incorporated so that clear expectations are set between the employees and all related stakeholders. This eliminates chances of any kind of discriminatory or subjective treatment by ensuring that a pre-established chain of rules are to be followed.
So Susmita, I was going to say, for just a quick question for you, and maybe Vikram can chime in as well. What are these policies kind of mandatory, or which ones are kind of required by law, and which ones might be best practice and perhaps avoid your headache?
So, Michael, so typically, this can be categorized in kind of 3 buckets. So one bucket is the statutory mandates, which are, mandated by law, the employment laws, and I'll lean on Vikram to kind of, share his views on those. The other two are governance based and best practices. So governance is based are, what does the employer believe in, what are the values, what are the philosophies, and what will be the governance model around it. So typically code of conduct, work timings, travel policy, relocation policy, etc. Whether you want to be an equal opportunity, diversity and inclusion is a key focus area for you, in which case you become an equal opportunity employer, etc., etc. So these are the more governance based policies. And some of the best practices typically are those which have been practiced by progressive organizations and have reaped some desired outcomes, and therefore are benchmarked for other organizations to follow. And a few examples of such policies are the agile or flexi our working policies, paternity leaves, etc.
Yeah, and maybe just to carry on that discussion, we do have some mandatory policies by law. One is on prevention of sexual harassment of women at workplace. We've got a law which was enacted about 5.5 years ago on workplace related sexual harassment, and there are certain requirements in terms of forming a committee to include an external member, and the committee is required to investigate, and there is a need to have a policy. There is also a need to have training, train the employees by way of creating awareness of the law and the policy. There's also a requirement to train the committee which will be investigating matters relating to sexual harassment. As a result of this particular law, and thanks to the Me Too movement, we've started seeing a lot of action on sexual harassment complaints, including several cases going up to the court. So, we've been sort of tracking it quite closely over the last few years and summarizing the case laws, given that it's a relatively new law. Another mandatory policy is on equal employment opportunity policy, given that we have a new law on disability and accommodation. There is also a need to have a data privacy policy. If you are involved in the securities law side, then there is also a need to have an insider trading policy. So these are obviously mandatory by law. And then there are other policies which are good to have. For example, use of office equipment, employers' right to monitor such use, and anti-bribery. Our anti-bribery law was changed in last year to also now hold the bribe giver liable. Earlier, only the bribe taker, which is the government official, was liable, but the law has now been changed to include the bribe giver liable. You might also want to have policies on confidentiality and what can be taken outside the company. Again, it all depends on the kind of business activities. Generally, my experience has been that employers still prefer clear and extensive policies for their employees. Given how the system works in India, they would prefer to put it in writing. They've also been, at least some of my foreign clients have been extending their global code of conduct to Indian offices. Obviously, that needs a legal review because there could be statements which is not in compliance with Indian law, or could be seen as if giving excessive rights to the employees. So you would want to do a review of the Global Code of Conduct for India. But other than that, it's common to see the Global Code of Conduct being extended to India.
That's helpful. Yeah, I think integration of the policies is also kind of part of the integration of the culture and the engagement with between the kind of headquarters and the subsidiaries and the employers and the employees. So with that, I think moving over to the employee engagement side, and I think the policies, we talked a bit about training and sexual harassment. We recommend, and I know Vikram works on training on the anti-bribery side of things as well, but these are excellent ways to breathe life into these policies and also engage with your team members in a way that really helps build these policies into the culture. Susmita will kind of speak to some of the other pieces related to employee engagement now as well.
Yeah. So employee engagement today, I mean, we've talked about talent sourcing, we've talked about onboarding, and the third piece is the best thing that employers can do after they've worked so hard to get the talent onboarded is to keep the employee engaged in their work, in their jobs, etc. And that again is posing a lot of challenges with millennials in the business today. Employee engagement will be one of the key differentiators for organizations in 2019 and onwards, because it's an issue that nearly every organizational leader is now thinking about and discussing. Typically, engaged employees feel like part of the larger mission of the organization and are aware of how their work helps them grow and understand the impact it makes on the others as well. So one of the important employee engagement trends in 2019, a few of them are, about purpose at work. And we haven't spoken about purpose at work for a very long time, but millennials today are talking about purpose at work. What is purpose at work? It's not just a generic statement about the product or the team's purpose or what they're doing or the job description, but it is a more compelling story that employees are telling about the work they do in terms of how it integrates with the long-term vision of the employers and the impact the business makes on the society at large. And that's what drives them, and that's what is the purpose of the work. Professional development has always been one of the key engaging factors for employees, but today employees are looking for and wanting more and more programs and learning interventions that make them future ready. That is the expectation on professional development. Employee wellness is another part, and even a decade back, I don't think we've spoken so significantly and so many times. The number of times I've been hearing about employee wellness is not funny, but it's being spoken about even more today, simply because we have to wake up to the reality that stress levels and emotional health issues in organizations are at an all-time high today. As a result, more employees, are offering benefits, not just in terms of health and medical plans, but in terms of organizing yoga sessions, having meditation rooms, organizing games, providing gym memberships, counseling and therapy programs, etc., etc.
Yeah, it's hard to disconnect in today's age, as we all know, and as we speak, to people across the world on different time zones through our devices. But I think one of the points before we move over to compensation and benefits is this greater purpose that I think everyone is looking at. And with India's CSR requirements, even if your firm or your organization does not meet the requirements to contribute to CSR, I think CSR activity is super important to engaging your staff and making an impact in the community, which people for the most part are interested in doing. So if they can do that in the work context, it's a win-win for everyone. So the next piece, Vikram, unless you have any points on the employee engagement side, we'll move over to some of these compensation and benefits issues.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So compensation, again, as we know, I mean, it's a huge, humongous topic with lots of nuanced discussions that we can have. But today we will have contain our discussion to what you can see on your screens. Compensation, as we all know, is the monetary value that is paid by organizations to employees in exchange of the services rendered. And there are primarily three components to a compensation structure. One is a fixed, one is a variable, and then there are additional benefits. The fixed is the one that is allocated without any changes, and it stays the same for a certain period of time, which is typically the performance period, and it comprises of like you can see on your screens, several components like the basic salary, the house rent, the HRA, which is the house rent allowance, which allows you to meet the cost of renting homes, etc. The leave travel allowance, meal allowances, books and periodicals. Now, there's a special allowance. So each of these, if you make changes to the amounts, etc., there is a likelihood that your take home gets impacted because of the way the taxability, the tax liability would play out. And therefore, it is important to, have a very keen sense in creating the salary structure and make it most tax friendly for the employees to protect, their take home packages, which is what most employees are concerned about. The variable pay has components. Again, variable pay, as the word implies, has a variable connotation to it, which means it could vary depending on it has various interdependencies and would vary depending on how the dependabilities would vary. So, for example, there's a performance linked pay. So the performance linked pay is basis how well you perform. There could be a bonus element which is linked to the company's performance, and therefore you're eligible to a certain percentage basis the company's performance. There are organizations that provide sales incentives, etc., which are all different kinds of variable pays. There is an element of perquisites or fringe benefits, which, for example, a lot of organizations provide a car, lease to employees, or a leased accommodation, or a driver allowance, etc. And all these are fringe benefits that organizations extend to their employees. A third category is the benefits package. Now, benefits is a mixed bag of some statutory requirements, which I will, request Vikram to cover. And apart from the non-statutory ones are the insurance, typically the medical health plans or the insurance plans that employees extend to their employers extend to the employees. And otherwise, there are also policy-driven benefits like leave encashment, which a lot of organizations provide to its employees. So the earned leave which is unused can be encashed at the time of separation, and that's what is leave encashment.
Okay.
Over to you, Vikram, for the statutory benefits.
Sure. So, as Susmita mentioned, CTC structuring is quite a complicated process in India and could involve experts from HR, benefits, finance, accounting, legal, tax. It's kind of a teamwork. In India, you can split salary into uh, allowances and benefits, and all of that from the perspective of minimum wages. But then, as you might be aware, we had a significant judgment of the Supreme Court on a provident fund, where certain criteria were applied in terms of determining which components of the CTC would be subjected to provident fund contributions, and the Supreme Court came back and reconfirmed or reiterated its previous view that any allowances that are universally, normally, and ordinarily paid to employees could be construed as basic wages for the purposes of provident fund contribution. And that judgment, which was delivered on February 28, 2019, led to revisiting the CTC structures across the country, across all sectors, because the impact was felt by everybody who were trying to limit their provident fund contributions only to the basic salary and were not including some of the other allowances that were not specifically excluded from the definition of basic wages. So this has been quite a bit of work we've been doing over the last several months, restructuring the CTC package. And then obviously when you come to CTC and benefits, one benefit that I don't see here, but it's pretty common, especially in the progressive sector, is stock options, something that a lot of companies have had different forms of ESOPs, ESOPs and share purchase plans and phantom unit plans and all of that, something that's gaining popularity in the country.
Thanks, Vikram. And I'm just mindful of time. We have 8 more minutes left. I want to remind our attendees that if you do have any questions, please type them into the chat box, and we'll answer them as they come in at this stage. We do have a few more slides to get to in 8 minutes. So Sunita, if you could touch on performance management fairly quickly, and then we'll move over to the next
Absolutely.
section on onboarding, which is really important.
That's right. Yeah. So performance management, there are different kinds of performance management tools that organizations use, etc. And we're, like I said, this again is one entire webinar that it would call for to delve into the details of different performance management systems. However, in terms of process, it's fairly simple. The basic is the 4D principle, and the 4 Ds here are for governing any performance management process. The 4 Ds governing are define, document, discuss, and develop. Define, just like any new initiative that you have, you need to define the standards of behavior and performance, and then define the matrices that you will map to those standards of behavior and performance. Document is to be consistently and frequently and copiously making documentation on all employee performances. And this is a note to all people managers who manage large teams. As much as you might want to avoid, this is the only thing that will stand in your stead in times to come, because copious documentation of employee performance is what will make the exercise objective and therefore more credible to your team member, when you are exchanging feedback, maybe at the time of after 6 months or 8 months or a year, depending on how frequently you have your feedback conversations. Discussion is the third part, and discussion, again, there is no devaluing the process of having constant ongoing conversations on feedback, on performance, on providing guidance, direction, etc. And finally, it's about development. So it's a common belief that performance reviews, lead to the compensation, the hikes, the promotions, etc. And that's what makes this exercise the more tricky one, and something that managers want to avoid all the time. However, when you shift the focus from just monetary rewards, etc., to employee development, I think organizations will be able to create this mindset change and be able to identify growth areas and build in development plans for individuals, rather than just focusing on gaps and focusing on the affiliated tasks and processes of revisions, salaries, hikes, etc.
Thanks, Susmita. Over to you, Vikram.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just quickly touch upon employee offboarding, which flows after performance management. And as I said earlier in my discussion, it's easy come but not easy go. In a country like India, a socialistic kind of a setup, which has been reflected in its labor laws. We don't have an at-will employment system, so you can't really fire at will. It's a US terminology. There are, as such, you can, if as an employer, if you want to terminate, you can only terminate for reasonable cause or for employee misconduct. There are some exceptions to that, but that's, in general. And for both, there are certain procedures to be followed or certain documentation required before you can actually terminate employment. In fact, one of the onerous provisions of, or what is called as a draconian provision of Indian labor law, is contained in Chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act, which basically applies to industrial establishments having more than 100 workmen, where you need prior government approval to retrench even one worker. This provision has met with a lot of criticism as such, and given the difficult provisions on retrenchment and employment termination, employers prefer to introduce voluntary retirement schemes or get the employees to resign, something that's fairly common. At least on paper, it is treated as a resignation and not as a termination. And obviously, the last point is about notice pay, severance, gratuity, leave encashment, employers' financial obligations upon termination that needs to be calculated upfront so that the financial liabilities are sort of met with and there is no breach on that side.
Thanks, Vikram. And I do want to keep to time, just mindful of everybody's schedules, and we have people joining in from across the world. So, I know it's late for you and Susmita. Susmita, I think
yeah. So
any
Michael,
one two dots before we sign
very
off
quickly.
on onboarding.
Absolutely. Very quickly before we end this session, and I think Vikram has touched upon some of the key aspects of involuntary separation, and some key aspects of involuntary separation, which is like termed as termination here, and he's thrown in some light on the legal aspects of involuntary separation. But typically, like I've been talking about, as we witnessed earlier in the session also, organizations are ready to pull out all stops for welcoming new joinees, but the same cannot be quoted for the separation process. And research has it that only 29% of organizations have a very, very formal, structured employee exit management process in place. Organizations do take measures to kind of de-risk themselves on the compliance breaches, etc. By retrieving all physical assets, wiping sensitive organization-related data on personal devices of employees who are separating. And all this is part of the handover, process. But the more crucial aspect of a good employee offboarding process is to treat employees warmly, regardless of the reason. Of course, not a termination, but any other reason of their voluntary separation from the organization. Because keeping in touch with separating employees and forming an alumni network will help build talent acquisition and brand reputation management. It also will ensure that the doors are always open to returning employees who have been assets in the past.
Thank you, Susmita. And I think we could spend a lot of time on this employee offboarding topic. We have worked very closely with Vikram on some very tricky situations involving our clients over the last few years, from organizations with hundreds of employees to those who are very small but have senior leadership challenges that they need sorted and need the local support on the ground and partners in order to do so. With that, I think we're 1 minute over. If you do have any questions, you see our information here on this last slide. Feel free to reach out. Vikram and Susmita, thank you so much for all of your inputs and your insights. Yeah. Excuse me?
I can see a couple of questions. Vikram.
Oh, okay. I just see this last one.
How do you tackle last-minute withdrawal from candidate joining due to competitive packages?
Okay.
Well,
So maybe I'll.
Yeah, Vikram, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just talking about it from a legal perspective, because I made that point about expect the unexpected. Under Indian law, you can't specifically perform a personal contract. An employment contract is a personal contract, and if you sign the contract and the employee sort of withdraws or does not show up, you can't really force him to work for you. Your only sort of ability is to sue him for breach of contract. Obviously, you're not going to go to the court, but the fact of the matter is that even if you go to the court and after a few years, the damages that you would probably earn would be equivalent to possibly the notice period and not beyond that, the salary for notice period. So it's not really worth it, from a larger scheme of things. So this is what you can do. I mean, some of these industry associations like NASSCOM and all were trying to come up with some sort of a non-poaching kind of a game plan to cover member companies, but it didn't quite go through. But I think, this is one area which, requires serious thinking in India.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And just to touch upon some of the more, so it's like, so one aspect of it is about, the non-poaching thing. The other aspect is, how do you tackle last-minute withdrawal from candidates joining competitive package? Now, I think it's also food for thought internally. And if it's a one-off case of one person or two people, two of your, incumbents doing it, maybe you'd just kind of take it in your stride. But if you have a pattern, if you notice a pattern, I think it's time that you relook at your own packages and see whether you are competitive enough in the market to either, provide that kind of an avenue growth path to individuals so that they are excited about joining you, or you're able to provide that kind of competitive packages that they are excited about joining you. So they have to, new joinees have to see some kind of a differential in you as a potential employer as well. And that is something that you need to relook at yourself and do a benchmarking study vis-a-vis your competitors to see where you are there.
Thanks, Susmita. And we have one more question. I realize we're losing some attendees, but just real quick, Susmita, on performance, can you shed some light on peer evaluation in the context of performance management, and then we'll wrap up the session. And like I said, we will be in touch with everybody about subsequent series of this where we'll get into a little bit more detail. But peer evaluation, Susmita.
Yeah, peer evaluation typically is a part of your 360-degree evaluation where you have, employees evaluated by yours, where you have, you are evaluated by your subordinates, your supervisors, and your peers, etc. Now, I am not very clear about on the context of this question, but peer evaluation is a part of 360-degree evaluations, and it's again, to build in and to see how holistically you're covering your evaluation, and you're taking feedback from all stakeholders in the workplace that you really interact with. And that's what peer evaluation is about.
Okay, sounds good. Vikram, any final thoughts from you before we push off? And we will be able to share this recording with everybody as well.
Well, nothing on this specific question, but obviously there are several other questions that will keep coming on this issue. And as we take on specific topics and debate them further, maybe we can look at it at that point in time.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, and thank you for everybody who has joined us in India, in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Michael, yeah, thank you, everyone. I just like to see, I can still now see some, questions coming in. So anybody who has any further questions, etc., please, the screen, you can see our email IDs. Just feel free to make a note and drop in an email with your questions, and we'll be happy to share our responses with you people. And thanks for joining us for this webinar. I hope this was some, we had a good time kind of, discussing between ourselves, and every such session is a learning session for us as well. I hope you enjoyed being with us as much as we enjoyed this discussion amongst ourselves.
Thank you, everyone.